That should be started now. Right, well, I don't know how everybody else's weather's been today, but it's been a lot. And as I keep starting these lately with the weather, we've had nice, lovely sunshine here today. And the last sort of quarter of an hour, Adam's probably got the same, as he's not a million miles from me. Absolute torrential downpours, and so there'll probably be floods all over the road again. So yeah, very, very bizarre year with weather. So tonight we have Dave Davis from Silage Solutions to give us his independent research and advice really on how to get silage right. I know it's always a tricky one, especially if you haven't got all the equipment yourselves and you're relying on contractors to come in and do various bits and pieces. But I will hand you over to Dave, and with the questions, remember, as always, there's never a silly question. If you're thinking it, ask it. Pop them in the chat as we go through, because I know Dave's got a lot of content to get through tonight. But if I think we need to ask it at that point in time with the slide, then I'll feed the questions in today. But just don't want to get bogged down with loads of questions on one slide and then we never get through all the content. So, but do feed your questions in so you don't forget them, and I'll feed them into to Dave as we go. So I think without further ado, Dave, I'll hand you over for you to share your screen and get going with telling us all how to make rocket fuel silage.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Katie. Good evening, everybody. Obviously, the weather's pretty poor about for silage making at the moment, and there's lots of people behind schedule on that. But when the time comes, hopefully we'll manage it. So I'm going to talk through very briefly many things. The last two on here, additives and mycotoxins, we can touch on. It was something that was raised when we first discussed this together. But the thing that I want to focus on, and it keeps reoccurring, is the losses that occur at every stage of the ensiling process. And many of these are not completely avoidable, but they are reducible. So if we start off with 500 tons of dry matter at harvest, we can lose 20 tons of that 500 tons in the field during wilting, and I'll run through some of those. Silo filling, unbelievable, we'll lose another 25 tons. Fermentation and effluent, well, the only one we can reduce to zero is actually the effluent losses by improving our dry matter and our wilting. But when we do that, we actually have an increased field loss. So there's a compromise there on, do we produce effluent or do we lose that material in the field? And then many of the ensiling processes, which I'll come into, will also influence feed out loss. And so from our 500 tons, the average farm loses 25% of the dry matter. So lost 125 tons, giving us 375 tons left. Now, if we can reduce those, and in a silage clamp, reducing those to 10% would be a very good target. But even just reducing by those by 5 or 10% increases not only the amount of silage we have left to feed, but the quality of that silage, because it's always the most nutritive part of that silage that we're losing. And those losses are visible. So, this silage here was, or this grass here was too dry. This is just overfilling trailers, as is this. Frequent occurrence and totally avoidable. The invisible losses are more difficult to control. And when I say invisible losses, I'm generally talking most of the time about carbon dioxide and water through various biological processes like plant respiration. So I will focus back on losses at various points during this evening's presentation, but we also need to consider the fields at the start of the season. Now, this is a pretty old slide here with dead and dying material in the base of that sward at the start of the season. Now, with climate change, quite frequently we actually have quite a lot of grass growth over the winter period, which can increase the issues around first cut silage making, and particularly an increasing risk of mycotoxins, dead material in the base of the sward, and increasing the risks of aerobic spoilage. But I'm going to focus on crude protein, because for our growing beef, our finishing beef, we do need silages that can have good levels of production from them. And to do that, we do need to get our silage protein levels up to, I would say, 16% as a target. In grass silage is not above 18%, but 16% is a very good target to aim at. Crude protein, which is what you get on your silage analysis sheet, is nitrogen multiplied by 6.25, so it's not true protein. And some of the things I'm going to talk about in terms of silage fermentation and speed of fermentation can increase the true protein level, and that can increase the utilization of that protein in the ruminant, meaning less nitrogen comes out the back end, predominantly as urine, and more goes into meat production. Now, if we have too low a level of crude protein, we need to supplement. If we have too high a level of crude protein in our grass silages, then the fermentation is challenged. So I said 16%. The ideal crude protein for grass silage would be 16 to 17%. So our target is to actually improve or optimize our fertilizer regime. And when I say fertilizer, I do mean farm manures in there, and ideally clover, so that we can actually get nitrogen free from the atmosphere. Now, when we're cutting our grasses, our nitrate N should be at around 0.15% in the fresh matter at harvest, and we can discuss that further during the questioning if you wish. Now, one of the key factors, one of the main factors affecting silage quality is the time of cutting. And when I say the time of cutting, I mean the maturity of that grass at that point of cutting. So if we've got a leafy material in the field, it'll be 78% digestible, ME 12.5. If you've got that long stemmy, high yielding forage, but with seed heads visible, that's a 58% D, an ME of 9.3. And this is how the constituents of these different plant components change as that plant matures from a leafy material to a stemmy material. The main changes are the NDF is increasing, the crude protein is decreasing, the sugars are increasing, and our lipid and ash are decreasing. Now, in terms of a fattening or growing beef animal, we really do need to push this silage making earlier so that we've got more leafy material, less stemmy material. That has two effects. First of all, it increases the quality because we have higher levels of protein, we have lower levels of fiber in terms of the NDF, but we actually have lower levels of the lignin. And it's the lignin that binds to the fiber fractions that reduces the digestibility. And the double whammy with that is that if we increase our ligninification, not only do we increase the levels of lignin, NDF, but we actually reduce the digestibility, which means that the animal also has reduced intake. So not only are they having less nutrients in every mouthful they're eating, they're actually eating less mouthfuls. So then we're more reliant on imported feedstuffs to fatten our cattle. So when we're looking at delaying cutting, which is a common event, dare I say, particularly on beef farms, we want more yield. We actually have a number of negative impacts on not only the animal, but also on the forage in the field. So first cut delayed by a week will give us possibly 10% higher yield of forage in that first cut material. But our digestibility is dropping by 3.5 units, our ME by 0.6 of a megajoule. And we actually have a higher field loss. That heavier crop, more dense, takes longer to wilt. And during that wilting process, we're losing more of the key nutrients. So our silage quality is dropping even further. And we actually have a slower regrowth in that field. So this is a graph showing the regrowth time from a frequent harvest in the green versus a less frequent harvest, a more mature harvest in the blue. And so if we start to look at that yield, not on a per cut basis, but on an annual yield per field basis, cutting on a 5-week interval, fifth week interval, increases our total yield in those fields over that growing season. Which means if you're a beef and lamb producer, you can actually, it's not about silage production, it's about using that grass either in the silage or the grazed grass form, so you have more of it. So we have a compromise. cut young, we have a lower yield per cut. An argument about lower percent dry matter, and we can again discuss that. Actually, it's not, and higher nutritive value. Now, often farmers look over the gate and see the yield in the field and think that's not enough. Cut late, higher yield. Debatable about the dry matter, like I said, lower nutritive value. And actually, to convince yourself, you need to look at calculating your milk yield per hectare. If you do that, you'll always be cutting young. You'll never be cutting late, unless it's. Go on,
Dave. There's a question from Mike saying, what timescale does it take to go from 78 D value to 58?
So if we go back to the graph, we could be talking 2 to 3 weeks, but we get a dry spell, a drought conditions, it could be a matter of 5 to 6 days. This year it's holding very well, the D value, because it's not been very sunny and it's been peeing down all the time. But you know, things change very quickly. It's also related to the heading date of the grasses you've got in your sward. So there's many factors, and what I encourage farmers to do is actually go and look at the crops and look. So this 78D grass would be totally leaf, there'd be no stem, and then as that stem starts to emerge, seed stem starts to emerge, then your D value starts to drop. So it's difficult to put an exact number on it, but you know, it's anywhere, depending on the weather conditions, between 5 days to 20 odd days.
Okay, thank you.
And actually, this study here, done at Hillsborough in Northern Ireland, beef finishing trial, D value, same fields, fields were split, 73 D value silage versus 59 D value silage. We can look at the live weight gains there, 1.1 kilos per day versus 0.78 kilos per day on those two different D values. And that was 15 days later harvest for this D value than this D value. So that's giving you a ballpark figure on that particular trial there in Northern Ireland. So massive improvement in that beef finishing trial by cutting early. And I was saying, this is some of the ABBA varieties, looking at the heading dates, which, you know, if you're looking at a grazing sward, maybe that works. But when you're looking at a silage sward, you want your heading dates as close together as possible so that you don't have this issue with a yield versus a maturity issue. So all your silage fields should have as narrow a window on heading date as possible, ideally within a week to 10 days of each other. If you have this spread of heading dates, you will never have high quality and high quantity forage, because some of those will be going to head before you've got the yield you desire. Now I'm going to jump to cutting forage for silage. This was a grassland demonstration up in North Wales a few years ago, and that's not water flying at the back end of that mower, it's soil. And there's a very frequent mistake by, let's say, contractors of cutting too low. It was a really nice day, as you can see by the haziness. But, you know, look at the mower on the stubble there, and you see the dust flying. And when we actually look at the contamination of that, this is a study from Chaggusk in just outside, well, about an hour from Dublin in Southern Ireland, where they actually measured the amount of clostridial contamination on a 2 centimeter cutting height versus a 10 centimeter cutting height. And the numbers are important, because at 2 centimeters, there were 84,000 clostridial in every gram of forage, versus the 10 centimeter cutting height, where there was 4,000. Now, Clostridia cause that butyric acid silage, that foul smelling silage. Not only do they cause that, they actually increase the level of dry matter losses. So with a butyric acid silage, you can easily have 10 to 15% dry matter losses just because of that poor fermentation. So when you have a higher number in your forage coming into your silo, whether that's a bale or a clamp, you're increasing the risks of that butyric acid fermentation. So when we look at the forage quality, this is the same field. We can see here, I picked some of that grass up. Not only have we included all this stem, which is undigestible, or lower digestibility. That'll be around 50% digestibility. When we put it in our silage clamp, the animals can't choose not to eat it, so it's mixed in with the leaf. So the overall silage has reduced digestibility, reduced intake, but actually on this example, we've actually taken out the root as well. And there's lots of data showing that the higher cutting height has a much more rapid recovery time. And so again, your yield is improved per acre, but also the quality is improved. So absolutely no reason we should be cutting low. And if we're going to be starting cutting in the next week or so, or 2 weeks, which I hope some of you will be, and you've got dodgy ground conditions, then I would strongly recommend a 10 centimeter cutting height. There's a number of reasons for that. Like I said earlier, when we cut low, we have more fiber, so less nutrients per mouthful. Because we're filling the rumen up and it's taking longer to digest that, we're having lower intake, so less mouthfuls consumed. When we have lower forage intake, if we're trying to finish those animals, we end up supplementing more, so that also increases our cost. And we have a slower regrowth, so we have a lower annual forage yield. And when we're looking at that forage and we're looking at wilting it, the stem actually is harder to wilt than the leaf. And I'll go through the reasons why in a minute. So moving on to wilting, even in the wet conditions we're having, if there's a risk of a shower, or the only time you should not be spreading that crop is if you've got a serious risk of soil contamination by driving on it. So spreading the crop improves the surface area to volume ratio of that forage, and it increases the speed at which water is removed from that crop. Now here we have a transverse section through a leaf, and unfortunately I can't do it on presentation mode. My laptop's not working on presentation mode when I'm doing a webinar, but underneath there is the stomata, and with those stomata open, and there's many hundreds of stomata on the underside of grass leaves, with them open we lose 100 litres of water per tonne per hour. When they close, that drops to 20 litres of water per tonne per hour. They only stay open for 2 hours after cutting. So the quicker we spread the crop behind the mower, the better. Now on the stems, there are very low numbers of these stomata. So actually, whilst our stems often feel drier when we squeeze them, that's because we can't squeeze the juice out, and actually they end up being wetter. So again, if we cut the stubble too low, we're increasing the water content in our grass. And also when we cut the stubble too low, we're actually removing a bed of stubble that when we cut higher, our grass sits on, and that increases the ability to airflow underneath that crop and through the crop to improve our wilting procedure. So there are so many reasons why our minimum cutting height should be 7.5 centimeters, and under some conditions, it should even be up as 10. Now, if we don't spread the crop, we end up with a slower wilt. So this is a study from New York State in America with Lucerne. They actually had a target dry matter at the point of ensiling of 44%, 45% dry matter, and they left some crops, some rows in the narrow swath, others in the wide swath in May, June, and July. Very good weather conditions, and they showed that with the wide swath, they could actually reduce their wilt time by 24 hours, more or less, in each of these occasions. So that's in America, arguably not that relevant to the UK. This is in Wales, and again, spreader mower versus a swath mower. Those are the wilting increases in dry matter over wilting. So as soon as you spread it, you significantly increase the level of that crop's ability to wilt. So that's reaching around 27% dry matter, cut at 9:30 in the morning and measured at 5 in the afternoon. Where it was cut with the swath mower, actually straight away we have a difference between the two, and it wilts a lot less quickly. So that was only reaching around 22% dry matter at 5 in the afternoon. So very important that we spread that crop. And again, by spreading the crop and improving the speed of wilting, we reduce some of the undesirable populations on the crop. So this is again from Chagascut Grange in Ireland, and it's showing the difference in clostridial numbers with wilting times. Now, this is on a log scale, so going from 1 to 2 is actually a 10-fold increase. And we can see how the clostridial numbers are increasing, and there's a big increase when we go from 14 to 35 hours. Looking at some of the other populations, so we've got the Clostridia there, either at 0, 24 or 48-hour wilt, the yeasts and the bacilli. So if we focus on the Clostridia and the yeasts in particular, we can see a 48-hour wilt is having a 10-fold increase in the yeast population, and not quite a 10-fold increase, but not far off in the Clostridial populations. Clostridia, as I said, butyric acid fermentations. The yeasts is what causes the heating when you feed out your silage. So all the time we wilt for longer, we're increasing the undesirable microflora. The other thing we're doing is actually increasing our losses, because when the crop is in the field, the grass is in the field and it's cut, our sugar is being respired either by the plant or by the undesirable microbes on the crop to carbon dioxide and water. And that is actually a dry matter loss. So this was a field study that I did some time ago on a farm not far from Aberystwyth. Cut at around 10 in the morning, 3 fields here, and they actually picked it up around 2, 3 o'clock the next day. So over a 24-hour wilt. And you can see the dry matter they achieved over that time was 38% dry matter. At the start of the immediately after mowing, it was around 18% dry matter. Now this farm has his own forage harvester, and I would argue, he's clamping it, his target dry matter should be somewhere between 32 or around 32% dry matter. So he had the ability to pick that up after 15 hours, but he left it for a further 10, 12 hours. Now, when we monitored the sugar content, the sugar at cutting was 22.9%. When it was picked up with a forage harvester, it was down at 18.7%. That sugar had been converted to this red bar here, which is carbon dioxide and water. Now, that affects the ME and the D value. So at mowing, it was 74.2% D value. At pickup, it was around 70.1. That's 0.7 megajoules of energy lost for every kilo of silage dry matter. Now, you will never reduce that to 0, because obviously we do need to get to a point higher dry matter during that wilting process. But he could have possibly halved that loss if he'd picked that crop up when it had reached that ideal dry matter for a clamp silage. So ideal cutting time to maximize our sugar content and maximize our ideal digestibility does depend on the time of year and the weather. In good wilting weather, if we can manage to cut after the dew has risen in the morning and pick up the same day in that evening, we will get a much better forage quality because we've reduced the time of that wilting. But that's not always possible. So if we've got poor weather or a heavier yield, we might need to cut early afternoon and pick up the next day. And like I said, bigger target here, target range 28 to 33. I'm not averse to a lower dry matter, providing we do everything right. Ideally, we want to hit that target because that's the best of everything. Reduces the risk of effluent losses, improves the fermentation, reduces the risk of aerobic spoilage, and the animals actually quite like silage at that dry matter.
Dave, you might be coming on to this, but there's been a couple of questions about what the effect a mower conditioner has on the grass wilting times.
Yeah, I deleted that slide. So mower conditioner, I would strongly recommend. The only time you need to be careful with a conditioner is depending on what legume crops you've got. White clover tends to not like over conditioning. You tend to get leaf shatter and lose some of the protein. Red clover, in a recent trial by Freen Wachen at Aberystwyth University, has shown that red clover is actually more robust of going through the conditioner. But yes, that will, with a grass only crop, it's an absolute must, because you will speed up that wilting time. But still, spread it as wide as possible out of the conditioner, and ideally I would still be going in with the tedder and tedding it out as well within an hour or two to improve that speed of wilting. Okay,
Thank you.
Here I have a field not far from the Royal Welsh Showground. Farmer very enthusiastic with his rake, but not actually looking at the detail. Again, a common practice where we're not setting our machines up right. This wasn't him. This was that demonstration, that grassland demonstration. But you can see the issue there. And each of those rotors does have an individual height adjustment on it. And when we actually look at the crop, you can see the clouds of dust there. When we look at the crop, soil contamination. Again, increased risk of Clostridia. So we might be thinking that we're picking up every drop of grass, but by picking up that soil, we're increasing our dry matter losses. And I have a saying, if we pick up less, we will have more silage because we're going to reduce the losses during that fermentation. We're going to have a better fermentation. We're going to have more nutritive value from that forage at feed out. And that's a very nice close-up of all the soil contamination from the farm in near the Royal Welsh Showground. Again, during rowing up, piles of dust coming off there, rake set too low. And when you cut too low, you have to rake too low to pick it all up. So again, that cutting height has an impact on that. Can't quite see the dust there, but if you've got loads of money, and I mean loads of money, you can pick one of these up. Ideal. This is what Dengie used to make their high dry matter lucerne for haylage for horses, but they are good pieces of equipment. Got a pickup reel and an elevator, conveyor belt where they drop it in a row at the end of the row. But some contractors are now actually buying into that, and it does seriously reduce your soil contamination. Now moving very quickly on to forage harvesting, and I am going to cover off on bales as well. Chop length affects the silage density, and these figures for the different chop lengths are published in the AHDB manual. They are things that we should try and stick to because we do need to alter the chop length depending on the dry matter of our silage. When we're getting wetter silages, when we're getting silages that are on a multi-cut system, whether it's all leaf, we're having increased risk of clamp slippage. And that's because with those wetter crops, we are actually over consolidating. And with the leafier material from the multi-cut, we're getting less fiber in the clamp. So we need a longer chop to keep that silage in the clamp. When we get to the higher dry matter silages, the big risk is aerobic spoilage due to air being trapped during filling, poor compaction, so we need to reduce the chop length. Unfortunately, the modern forage harvesters cannot chop this long, but we need to try and persuade the people in charge of those to chop as long as they can. If there's a lot of people in your area doing a multi-cut, then I would suggest that you have a chat with the contractor to take some of the knives out to make that longer chop. So when we're looking at compaction, 5-6 years ago, I would have said compaction was the most important thing. It's still very important, but just remember on those wetter silages, over compaction causes clamp slippage. So actually we need to pull back when we've got low dry matter, very leafy material on our compaction. And we can talk through that in a minute. When we've got higher dry matter, risks of aerobic stability, aerobic spoilage, heating at feed out, we need to consider compaction, and compaction is absolutely key, getting good compaction, high levels of compaction to reduce that spoilage. So when we're talking about those two extremes, I recommend different layer depths. So the wet silage or the very leafy silage, we need, sorry, this is the bottom one. We need a 25 centimeter layer depth when we're filling our silage clamps. That means even layers, consolidate as we go. When we go to higher dry matter, we need 15 centimeter layer depths to get that good compaction. Now, a study in the States at Wisconsin University showed that using the same machinery and increasing the layer depth by 15 centimeters reduced the density by 100 to 120 kilograms fresh matter per meter cubed. Hence, with our wetter stuff, we need to increase the density. With our drier grass, we need to reduce the layer depth to improve our density. Skip that one. Now, I don't know whether you've come across these machines. They are railway wagon wheels on a frame. They have a very, very positive effect on the speed of compaction. They can also increase the level of compaction. So that's a bad thing if you're on a wet silage. But then by increasing the layer depth, you can then also use these machines. I don't recommend them on silages or grasses less than 25% dry matter. They've been used for many years in the Czech Republic. and the Czech Republic is one of the countries that makes the best quality silage in Europe. They have the advantage that you're compacting a whole tractor width, not a wheel width. So actually you can speed up your speed of filling and keep pace with the contractor, but maintain consistent consolidation. And consolidation has a big effect on losses. So this is a study from 35 farms in the US. They measured the density in kilograms of dry matter per meter cubed, and they measured the level of losses after 180 days of ensiling. And what they found was that as the density increased, the level of losses dropped. So poor density, 160, that's around 500 on a fresh matter basis, had 20% losses. So for every 10 loads that went into that clamp, 2 loads never got to the animal's mouth for feeding. Where the density increased to 320, so this is around 750 kilograms on a fresh matter basis, then the losses dropped to 10. So even there, with that very good density, they were still losing out of that 10 loads, 1 load before it got to the animal. So that just shows how density affects the losses and the quality. Now, unfortunately, this isn't in the right form. But anyway, one of my big bugbears is that the vast majority of silage clamps are not sealed properly. I can't see the audience, but I suspect there's a number of us in the audience that can remember putting big bales in bags before film wrap was developed. And when you put a big bale in a bag and you tied it correctly, it blew up. And that was not the heat on the black polythene, but actually carbon dioxide that was trapped within that bale. Now, not very many silage clamps blow up, but they should do, because if they blow up, that means we've trapped the CO2 in the clamp. That CO2 inhibits the aerobic processes, and all the aerobic processes in silage having detrimental effect on the silage quality and increasing the loss of silage dry matter. So when we filled our clamp, well, before we fill it, we should always use a side sheet. We cannot seal a clamp properly without the side sheet. We fill the clamp, and then we put a cling film on the top. We pull the side sheet in. Then we use gravel bags, and the gravel bags should be touching all the way down the side, all the way along the back, all the way down the ramp, and all the way along the front. And if we put them touching, we will seal that clamp properly, and we will trap the carbon dioxide in. We will have better silage quality and better nutritive value. Now, as a little trick, if you've got an outdoor clamp, rainwater will fall on the top sheet. It'll run down the side sheet, and it'll soak back into the silage here. And that will reduce, or they'll change the dry matter across that feed out, and it'll increase your risks of not feeding enough silage on a wet day. If you're feeding a TMR, you'll get your TMR wrong because your balance of dry matter will be changing. So as a little trick, if you put the gravel bags touching around the side and then put the top sheet on, and then put another gravel bag holding that top sheet to the side, to the second gravel bag with the top sheet coming over here, you actually trap the water on the top, and that will actually increase the weight on the top when the silo is closed, but it also means the only way out for that rainwater is off the front, and so you reduce the ingress of water into your silage clamp. The other thing that I see fairly frequently is that we don't sheet up quickly enough. Now, if you're taking more than a day to fill your clamp, you should pull a sheet on overnight. That can have a very dramatic effect on your silage quality and improve it. But also, you know, if you finish in the evening, you really should pull that sheet on that night. Ideally, seal it properly that night, but you should certainly have started that sheeting process. This is a study showing how immediate sealing versus, and admittedly it was 48 hours later, and not too many farms are 48 hours later, but by leaving that clamp open, not only are you allowing that CO2 out, but you're sucking in more air. And so they did this with an untreated and an inoculated silage, and they showed how the aerobic stability of the clamp was improved where they had immediate sealing compared to late sealing. So what they were showing here was the number of hours before that silage started to heat at feed out. So a doubling, more or less, in the aerobic stability of those clamps when they were sheeted immediately. Cling film is very, very popular these days. I prefer it to be a cling film that is a separate cling film, not one of the ones that's attached to a traditional black sheet, because the cling film has the effect of actually clinging down very tightly to the surface of that clamp. That reduces the ability of oxygen to penetrate into that silage. When it's attached to the black sheet, they don't separate quickly enough for it to cling down properly. Then within the cling films, there are two types. There's the standard polyethylene and there's the oxygen barrier. And the oxygen barrier cling film does cost more, but it actually reduces the permeability of oxygen through that sheeting. This is a study of 11 farms doing a combination of with parts of the clamp with, parts of the clamp without the cling film. And 10 of those 11 farms had a big improvement in the aerobic stability in the top meter of that silage. One farm wasn't, and I suspect that farm was doing everything absolutely perfectly. But if you look at the aerobic stability, 50% of the farms had almost 3 days extra aerobic stability. So big improvement from that cling film. Now, I said about this carbon dioxide keeping it in. Many farms don't seal the clamp properly. CO2 is heavier than air, so it seeps out through at some point along the ramp. That actually creates a vacuum in your silage clamp, and nature doesn't like a vacuum, so oxygen or air, more correctly, will be pulled in somewhere else. And that oxygen then enables the aerobic processes to carry on. And that's quite frequently why you have shoulder waste and top waste, is because that clamp isn't sealed correctly. Now, like I said, CO2 is heavier than air, sinking out the bottom. So this process, if it's not sealed properly in your silage clamp, is like a chimney in reverse. So rather than the hot air and smoke rising, the CO2 is falling out, sucking in oxygen at the top. That's continually happening when you feel that your silage clamp is sealed. And some work in Germany showed that by stopping that CO2 escaping from the bottom of the clamp, it reduced the losses by 4% in your silo. So this is a friend of mine from Mid Wales. Some of you might know him, Arwel Owen. He's a Charolais cattle breeder. He's also a Genus employee. This is his silage clamp one year where it blew up like a bouncy castle because it sealed it exceptionally well. And he continues to do that. He has very, very high quality silage and produces a lot of live weight gain from that silage. When we're using the green mesh as our top cover, we need to finish our silage clamp in a dome. We need to tighten up the gravel bags to keep that tight for the first week as the silage settles, because it's the pressure on the top of that silage, not the weight. So it's the pressure from that being taut that keeps the pressure on the top of the silage to reduce top silage losses. Alternatively, tires touching, a very good way of keeping that top weight on. Obviously they have other issues, but I do like to see sufficient top weight to make sure we keep the compaction in that top layer. Now I'm going to quickly move on to baled silage, because I've no doubt we have baled silage producers here. When we chop our bales, and most balers are now choppers, but still some people prefer to leave them unchopped. I can't for the life of me fathom out why, but we improve our density by chopping. Density means that we've got more grass within a given unit of area volume, means we've got less oxygen, and oxygen is the biggest factor causing losses. So when we did unchopped versus chopped, we found higher dry matter in our chopped bales. That's because when we've got oxygen, we produce water. So we produce water in this clamp, in this bale. So lower dry matter, lower pH, higher sugar. Because we've had a more efficient fermentation, we actually preserve more sugar. The ME, which is based on the NIR calibration, wouldn't pick up these differences. But if we looked at the feed out value and did that by animal studies, we probably would have found an ME difference as well. When we look at the number of layers of film, another factor, and again, we look at sugar content. The more layers of film we have on there, the better the sugar content, because of that improved fermentation. But actually, what's more important, other than that sugar content, is the fact that we have lower mold coverage, we have lower dry matter losses, so we've got more silage. This film seal is a method we use in research and in practice where there's problems on farms, where we actually put a very small hole with a one-way valve into your through your bale wrap. We suck out the oxygen with a plumber's plunger, and we measure the time it takes for the oxygen to penetrate back into that bale. And when we have more layers, it takes longer for that oxygen to penetrate back in, just showing that this is the reason why we've got our lower mold coverage and our lower dry matter losses. Another thing that sometimes happens when you're wrapping your bales is that you might not quite put enough revolutions on there to get that 6 layers of wrap or that 4 layers of wrap. So this was a study funded by the Welsh Meat Promotions, HCC. And what we found in this study was that 14 revolutions with our bale wrapper combination was not enough to put 6 layers of wrap on. 4 layers of wrap. It was 16 revolutions was putting 4 layers of wrap on all of it. This 14 revolutions were parts of that bale that only had 3 layers of wrap. So our film seal was poor. But more importantly, we actually did a enumeration of listeria, and we had a very high number of listeria where we'd missed a very small portion of that bale with the 4 layers of wrap. Listeria are microaerophilic, so they had enough oxygen in there to survive and grow compared to the 16 revolutions. So this is increasing herd health in terms of listeria, and also if you're a sheep producer, a higher risk of abortion because of that higher level of listeria, because the bales weren't wrapped quite correctly. When we consider, I talked about losses at the start, and our standard losses or our average losses on a clamp were 24%. This is a study comparing clamp silage versus chopped bale versus unchopped bale. And actually, we can see that our chopped bale has the lowest level of losses in this comparative work. And so when we consider bales as being expensive, we're only thinking about it from the perspective of making those silages. We're not thinking about it from the perspective of how much silage we've got left to feed. And the biggest effect on that cost is the dry matter loss. So often bales will come out at a very similar cost to clamp when we consider it on a kilos of silage fed basis. And often people have their own opinions, clamp best, bale best. When we actually do the studies side by side, so alternate rows, if you like, into clamp and bale, we see again in this study at Aberystwyth, at Eiger Aberystwyth, we have those lower losses with our bales versus our clamp. When we look at the fermentation and the other parameters, very little difference between the two. When we look at red clover, we didn't have sugar on this last slide, but with a red clover clamp versus bale, actually in terms of forage quality, our sugar levels in our bales will be higher because we have a lower requirement for fermentation. And you can see there, lactic is lower. And that's because we're not chopping it as finely as we are in a clamp. We have a more restricted fermentation, meaning that we're preserving more sugar. I'm very aware of time. So I'll just quickly run through a few slides on feed out and then we'll have some questions. This is an exceptional herd in Derbyshire. It's a dairy cow herd, but it's just showing how robust and how utilizable bale silage can be. And you can see the stacking yard there of the bales. When it comes to feed out, they can feed out each cut and actually have a very good mix across those. Not suggesting you do this on a beef and sheep farm, but it's just bearing in mind that bales have a very good fit in many production systems. Now, when we look at clamp silage, we can have clamps managed like this, or we can have clamps managed like this. This one is probably nearer the 10% losses, which was my strict target. This one is probably running at 45% losses as a guesstimate. So lots of different ways of feed out management. I thought I'd just share you this slide. This one's Estonia. This one's actually in the Ukraine. This was in Lithuania. And this one's in the UK. And the only one that's anywhere near any good is this one in Estonia. Now, hopefully, I'm talking to a group of farmers that are managing their clamps more like this. If you're doing any of these other operations, Basically, you're allowing more oxygen into your clamp. You're increasing your spoilage losses. This clamp here, where they'd used the shear grab, that has tenfold less surface area for oxygen to ingress into that clamp. So we do need to look after that silage at feed out. It's about a sharp cutting implement, keeping a solid face, reducing oxygen ingress, and ideally a rapid enough speed across that clamp face to maintain that silage quality, the anaerobic conditions to reduce your aerobic spoilage. Now, Mike Wilkinson and myself published some work where we'd estimated that aerobic spoilage of silages costs £70 million annually to UK farmers. So it's a critical part of the silage making process. Many of those losses are because of poor density, which is going back to filling the clamp. And poor density at the start means that oxygen can penetrate further into that clamp at feed out, increasing those aerobic spoilage losses. This is an example of a feed out method on this farm where they were feeding out with a bucket, and they were persuaded to use a shear grab on half of the clamp because they didn't believe the bucket was causing their issues. And it's a thermal imaging camera view, and the difference between the two sides, I think, was 35 degrees centigrade. So the shear grab had reduced oxygen ingress, it had reduced the ability of the yeast and molds to grow, and so more of the silage quality was maintained, less of it was being used by the yeast and molds to produce heat. I'm going to leave it there because I do want you to have a chance to ask questions rather than going through a couple of other things. But if you've got questions on other things, please feel free to ask.
I think we're okay for time. If you want to just do your last few slides, Dave.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll be okay.
Okay. So we talked about the fungi very briefly. This is your yeasts. These initiate the aerobic spoilage. These don't produce mycotoxins. These are the molds, and these have the ability to produce mycotoxins when they're stressed. Not all species do, not all strains do. And it's important to remember that silage free of mold is not necessarily free of mycotoxins, and I'll come back to why in a minute. And moldy silage does not necessarily contain mycotoxins. And as you can see here, we have a couple of lovely blue cheeses, Shropshire Blue here, Pearl Lass on the right. That blue cheese, that's penicillium, no mycotoxins. However, if you've got mycotoxins in your silage, 0.3 of a gram in every ton of dry matter can cause health or production problems in your livestock. And that's why it's a mycotoxin binder seller's dream, because it's such a little amount and it's very difficult to detect. So what are they? Well, there's a whole range of them. Different fungi produce different mycotoxins. And if we go from this side, these tend to be field formed. So these are pathogenic fungi that attack the crop, whereas these on this side are storage formed. So this is as a result of aerobic spoilage, and they grow on dead organic material. So when we're talking about the field formed mycotoxins, where we've got dead material in the base of the sward, we're increasing the risk of a field formed fungus growing and causing issues. Where we've got a more mature crop, stemmy, seed head crop, more risk of field form because that crop is more vulnerable to pathogens. This end, it's all about density, good sealing, and maintaining a good feed out management. So there's a whole range of them, and some of these are very toxic. These penicillium ones are increasing we're finding them much more frequently over the last 3 or 4 years. Has been a rise, and they are toxic to the rumen bacteria. So they act a little bit like antibiotics on some of the rumen bacteria, reducing intake, reducing production. Most of the others in a beef animal and in sheep that we find in the UK, most of the fusarium ones are fairly easy or relatively robust in the rumen that they can actually cope with them, unless you've got exceedingly high levels. So there is a new challenge. Variable weather conditions mean the plants get stressed. They're more vulnerable to attack from fungi in the field. There is a greater risk of field form mycotoxins. And also the milder winters that we're having means that there's less winter fill of those kill of those fungal epiphytic flora. So everything I've said about cutting higher, wilting rapidly, and in particular, making sure you fill and seal your clamp correctly will reduce the risks of some of these mycotoxins. And then very quickly, a couple of words on silage inoculants. There's many out there. My advice to farmers is to seek out independent advice on what additive to use, and seek out trial work that shows that those particular products have a benefit for animal performance. There are two types of inoculants on the market, or two types of inoculant bacteria. There's the homofermentative. They take glucose and fructose, the main two sugars in our forages, to 2 molecules of lactic acid. They reduce our dry matter losses, they speed up the fermentation, and they preserve more of that sugar and protein or the protein in the true protein form, better animal performance. And then there's the heterofermentative, and this is a hell of a slide, but basically these bacteria, Buchneri, Hilgardii, there's a number of them. They produce a number of end products from our sugars, including acetic acid, ethanol. They are less efficient at bringing down the pH. So you end up with higher losses, as you can see here, and you end up with poorer silage quality. The only potential benefit is that those silages can sometimes have improved aerobic stability, so less heating at feed out. But in terms of the overall picture, in terms of the losses, you've just shifted those losses away from feed out losses because you're increasing your losses during that preservation phase. So it's worth bearing in mind, and many of the additives contain a mix of the two, with the claim that they'll have the homofermentative to carry out the rapid fermentation and the heterofermentative to carry out the aerobic stability. But nature doesn't work like that, and all the trial work with those mixed ones has never shown a positive animal production response. So the advice on additives is seek out independent advice and be very cautious about trusting what you're told from a silage additive sales rep. Thank you.
Is that all? Do you want to stop sharing your slides, Dave? Just so
will do.
We can bring everyone back bigger if that's all of them.
Yep.
And then I will start. We've had a few questions come in already. So Adam's question, what about the leaf loss in red clover from tedding? So
it did surprise me when I saw these results from Greenwachen, but mower conditioner, no difference between no non-conditioner and conditioning. When it comes to leaf loss, it depends on the dry matter at which you're tedding it at. So I would still be gently tedding if it's below that 25% dry matter. If it gets drier than that, you need to be very careful. And if you've missed a window because all of a sudden it's become very hot, dry and windy, I recommend then, if you're 30% dry matter, actually rowing up with the dew on it, so that the dew helps to stick that leaf to the stem and you lose less.
Okay, thank you. Have you got any tips for ensiling GS4 type grass herb lays?
Yes. I would strongly recommend a 5-week cutting regime, because as soon as you go above that, you end up with particularly some of the herbs going to seed very quickly. You actually, if you do a 5-week cutting regime, you actually maintain the sward diversity better, because the grass doesn't take over and swamp out some of the herbs. And when you go above that 6-week stage of growth, you end up actually reducing your quality very, very dramatically. In terms of ensiling it, you need an additive that's 1 million homofermentative bacteria, because it's a difficult crop to ensile, because you've got the protein, you've got the legumes, high in protein, high in buffering, low in sugar, and your herbs are high in minerals, so higher ash content. They are also more difficult to ensile. If you're baling, which, unless you've got a large area of herbal lays, I would strongly recommend baling, because you can then keep it within you know where it is to feed out, so you can feed it out to the right stock or make the best use of it. But if you're baling it, I again would strongly recommend actually wrapping in the stacking site, which is what you should do for all silages, but because of modern machinery they tend to get wrapped in the field. But with the herbal lay, because you've got a stemmier stubble, you're more risk of puncturing that wrap and causing issues or reducing quality and getting moldy silage at feed out.
Okay, thank you. Dave was more of a comment really, that he changed from clamp 3 years ago to bales, and now he's got very, very little wastage. So that's nice to hear, Dave, that you've had that positive experience. And yeah, no, that's good.
I just want to interject on that. Some farms are very good at managing bales, and some farms hate bales and like to puncture every bale as soon as they pick it up. So, and I've worked with both.
Yeah, so I suppose it's just how you manage and deal with both of them, the management of them.
Yeah.
Sean's got a question. Do protein levels in grass drop quickly once the crop has used all the nitrogen applied? If so, do we need to try and cut once the chemical fertilizers should have all been used up by the grass?
It does drop. It drops more quickly as it goes into that rapid growth in the last 10 days or so, when it goes to seed stem formation. I have a piece of advice which I didn't share today, which is to do a pre-cut analysis, not to say whether you should cut your silage on that day, because often you're dealing with the weather and the contractor, so you're going to cut it anyway. But if you do a pre-cut analysis and you're looking for two things, you're looking at the crude protein level and the nitrate N level. And if your crude protein is at 17-18% and your nitrate N is at 0.15% on a fresh matter, you have hit your target with your fertilization. And when I say fertilization, I mean all forms of nitrogen. If you're at 14% crude protein and your nitrate N is down at 0.05, that means you did run out of nitrogen in that crop, and you should have either cut earlier or added a bit more nitrogen. If you're above 17-18% and your nitrate N is at 0.2, that shows you've got residual nitrate N in there. If you look after that crop, you can still ensile it at that stage, but it does show that you could have cut back on your fertilizer N. And I'm using that as a gauge so that you can then go in subsequent cuts, subsequent years, and actually alter that. But bearing in mind that the weather does have an impact on that as well.
Okay, thank you. Do pop some more questions in, or if you want to ask them yourselves, and just use the raise your hand function, and we can bring those in a minute. So William said, how long does the nutrient level to drop once you feed out a bale of silage? I guess it's how long when you feed. You must be feeding the bale slowly. Is that right, William? Do you want to unmute yourself and just extend on your question? Maybe you can't unmute. It doesn't 100% read right, the question. Oh yeah. Yeah, they have it ad lib, so
it depends how long, you know,
or sheep, but
it depends how well you've managed your bales. So if you're getting heat, so if you put a thermometer in it and you're getting heat generated, you're losing nutrients. If you wrap your bales well, they're very dense, you have 5-6 days, depending on how long it's been ensiled for. So the longer you've kept it wrapped, the better the aerobic stability is, the slower the nutrient loss. So there's so many variables there. There's a lot of variables there, but I've opened bales and they've been very stable for 10 days because they were so dense. So it does depend on all those variables. Ideally, you want to feed that bale out within 3 days, 4 days, but you have got extended periods if you've looked after it better. Sorry, I got distracted by the questions coming in and now I can't see them.
That's all right.
Feed out across the clamp face was one of them. Ideally, I like 3 days, but if you've done a good job on very good density, very good sheeting, you can have longer. A farmer in North Wales who won the Wales silage competition for his clamp had all his clamp faces open, all 4 clamps at one point when I was there, no problem with aerobic stability, and it was taking 5 days to get across the whole lot. So it's all about managing the whole process, but ideally I like 3 days, particularly now where we're not even getting cold winters. If it was a cold winter, I'd say 5 days. But if you can't do it in 5 days, but you've managed everything else, you will get away with that longer period.
Okay. One from James here. The Hillsborough slide showed the yield reduction increased in intakes for early cutting date. Have they provided figures for the weight gain per hectare given the reduced stocking rate that this would cause?
No, they didn't. But some work, and it was dairy farm work from SAC. I'm going to call it SAC because it was SAC at the time, and I can never remember the new name. Up in Auchincruve, had a 2-cut system, and actually their yield reduction on a 2-cut system of a traditional versus a multi-cut was there was no yield reduction over a 2-cut system. Further work by Ecosile on a farm in South Wales showed that with a 3-cut system versus a 5-cut system, their yields were significantly higher, even though the period of growing the forage was the same. So I think if we get hung up on that yield, we're going to miss the point because our total yield will increase. And then coming down to the costs of producing that silage, that very much depends on the system you're using. So for bales, there's a very slight increase in cost because you've got a higher mowing cost, but as you're paying per bale, your bale costs on a multi-cut or on a more frequent cutting versus a traditional cutting, the costs are very different, very similar. Some contractors now that are forage harvesting are actually switching their costing system because they realize more farmers are doing a multi-cut system. So they have an area plus a tonnage payment, which then works out very favorably for a multi-cut system. And farmers that are filling the fuel tanks on the forage harvester have found that there's a significant fuel saving with the multi-cut system because the forage harvester hasn't got to work so hard. So I think you've got to look at those costs properly and not assume there's a higher cost from a multi-cut system in the production. And when you take into consideration the benefits in terms of better quality silage, the costs will always come down in favor of a multi-cut system or a more frequent, higher nutritive value cutting system. And if we just go on to, variable weather, so be it drought or be it excessive amount of water, the multi-cut system again is more robust. So if we've got smaller weather windows, we've got a lighter crop, we've got a more rapid time to wilt. Dodgy weather, you can grab that in a day. If you go to drought conditions, because you're cutting more frequently, less of your crop is in a dead and dying state because you've let it go so mature that actually when you've got drought conditions, the crop recovers quicker as well.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you. And how do you do a pre-cut analysis on grass? Do the new type silage analysis machines do this?
So you do a snip sample across the field, ideally the week you're doing that grass, and you put it in the post and send it to the lab for a fresh grass analysis. So Trow Nutrition, Scientech, Eurofins, they all do a grass analysis. I would question the value of some of those things on there. So if we look at sugar content, because as soon as you cut the grass, the sugar's disappearing. If you cut it in the morning versus the afternoon, you've got different sugar content. I disregard any sugar value on those in that pre-cut analysis. Your fiber content, you should be able to have a guesstimate from the stage of the growth of the crop, but the protein value is very useful. It's something you can't see, and it will be relatively accurate on those at NIR. In terms of the if the question was about the forage harvesters having that on, they won't have nitrate N. They will have crude protein. I'm not convinced. I'm talking about the John Deere Harvest Lab. I'm not 100% convinced on the accuracy of that for protein through the forage harvest chute.
Sorry, I'm just trying to look. There used to be a list on AHDB. There used to be a list of all the different companies that do soil tests and silage analysis. So I was just trying to see if that's there. I'll have a look in a minute when you're answering the next question. The next question is, do any comment on making high dry matter, as in 50% baled silage, to reduce baling costs?
Yeah, don't do it. That's a simple answer. My reason for not doing it is that your wilting time to get to that high dry matter, unless you've got very, very good weather conditions, is increasing your losses, reducing your nutritive value. And when you bale high dry matter silages, you tend to have more risk of a poorer preservation phase, a higher risk of yeast and molds. And if you actually asked the animal you were feeding it, or if you offered those animals 50% dry matter and 30% dry matter, you would have significantly better intake and production from the 30% dry matter. So it comes down to this the same old thing that we keep coming down to. Farmers focus too much on the cost of production rather than the value of what they've produced. And so, yes, I agree, you do have an increased cost because you're going to make more bales to get the same level of dry matter in, but you will get better production from that wetter silage. And again, you've got your own farms, you could do that trial yourself, and so long as you really look intently at those costs, I think, I'm not going to say I'm right, but I think on the average farm, my suggestion would be correct.
Okay. There's a comment here on the slide that showed the comparing of the clamp and the bale silage. The baled silage preserved better through, although the cattle gain was 0.75 on the bale and 0.8 on the clamp. Any idea why that was the case?
No, it was a study from Northern Ireland, which it is a very old study, actually. It's probably the last century. Preservation isn't always intake. There could be many reasons for that. The feed conversion efficiency, I'm not sure whether that was on there, I think was very similar. So whilst they weren't significantly different. I know there was a number different, but they weren't significantly different. And again, that's a trial work. So, on farm, if you're somebody that's not going to look after your bales, then you're better off with clamp, and vice versa.
Yeah. Okay. I have shared the link to a whole long list of companies which do both soil and forage analysis. So there's a whole long list on there, which hopefully may help some people if you haven't got someone that you regularly use. James, I'm not sure what your last question is. Should read why that is the case. I'm not sure what that question is saying. Has anybody else got any more questions? Do type them in the chat or pop your hand up and ask the questions. There's a hand up.
It's Carl speaking here, Katie. Dave, brilliant presentation, very good. I'm in the car here, unfortunately, but come back to grassland management, and Katie, hopefully this will maybe help some of the communications we have had recently. I was intending to spread lime, so was on my grass this year, but obviously conditions haven't allowed that at the minute. I've made the decision at the minute to hold off at this stage because I'm concerned about contamination coming back into the clamp. Would that be a fair assumption, to leave the lime spreading at the minute into a stage later on in the year which is more favourable?
I would absolutely agree with that, especially if you've got any grass cover that you are then intending in siling, because obviously your lime's not going to be in the field where you need it, and it's actually going to be in this clamp, and it's going to be reducing your pH decline. So yeah, I'd hold off.
Yeah, perfect. Is there an advisable time when to do that? I've been just talking to my contractor today about it, and we're considering maybe doing it after first cut, prior to a covering of slurry, possibly, to try and keep it in the ground rather than going back onto the grass again. Would that be advisable to maybe do that now, or leave it until later on in the year?
I would definitely leave that. Oh, if you're going after a cut, All depends what the weather does, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, indeed. Yeah,
I'd err on the side of caution and not do it.
fair enough.
Because if
Good.
you know, if
Okay.
you get a dry spell and it all grows up in the grass, then you're going to have a disaster on the next
Yeah,
crop, whether that's a grazed or a silage crop.
Yeah. What's the impact of them possibly getting that later on in the year and possibly not being into the ground with grazing sheep, possibly over the winter grazing? Would that have any impact on that as well?
Right, I'm going to pass on that one, and I'm going to pass it over to an expert who's not me.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Brilliant.
Sorry, Carl, but yeah, no, I think you might need to speak to someone else on that one. Of
No, okay. Yep. No problem.
Sorry, I'd rather not answer than give you a wrong answer.
Okay, great. No problem, Dave. Brilliant. No, at least you're honest. They are. Yeah.
You're always allowed to say you're not sure, and I'd rather someone say you're not sure than give them an answer which isn't actually correct or a knowledgeable answer. So, has anybody else? Oh, there's another one come in. Ian, try calcifert. Is that what you're saying to Carl? Do you want to unmute Ian and just expand on what your comment is?
See, but possibly maybe G lime instead of spread lime, possibly the granular lime.
Yeah, I'm not sure what. We'll see whether he unmutes to say. And Adam's saying that, yeah, the sheep love the calcium. So if nobody else has got any other questions, I will just keep an eye on it for a second. Oh no, he's Mike. Calcifert is granular lime. Yeah, that's what he's saying.
Yeah.
So you could try that. Yeah, if anybody else has got any other questions for Dave, then do type them in the chat. But thank you very much, Dave, for sharing your knowledge. Hopefully, I know it's always a challenging time, especially if you need to get contractors in because everybody wants them at the same time. But yes, try and, as you're always trying to do, obviously make the best silage you can. So getting prepared, getting those clamps ready or bales, making sure you mark the bales from different fields or different cuts so that it's not just a guess of which ones you think were from where or which ones are the best and which ones are the worst, because obviously you've got different classes of stock that you might want to feed them to as well. So it's just making yourself as prepared as you can really for both the making of it and then obviously the feeding of it to reduce your wastage. So hopefully Dave's giving you some top tips tonight to take home and apply back on your farms. So thank you very much for giving up your time, and I hope you all have a nice rest of your evening. And those that haven't already signed up, the last one for a little bit, next week we have a webinar on reducing fuel usage by maintaining your machinery better. So if you haven't already let me know and you want to join onto that one, then let me know and I will get you signed up, and hopefully see some of you next week. But thanks again, Dave, and have a good rest of your evening, guys. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.